in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Jen Casimiro. She is the Global Talent Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at IDEO. Jen, thanks for being here. You were just on one of our webinars. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Of course. Super honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Jen Casimiro. Like Christina said, I am a cisgender third generation Filipina, married to a first generation Filipino man and then mother to a second/fourth generation Filipino boy. I currently live on Bay Miwok land, which is colonially known as Concord, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And like you said, I serve as IDEO's Global Talent Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And when I was younger, when folks asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I very consistently said I wanted to be a pediatrician until I learned what that meant, and learned what schooling and what that meant in terms of studying and all of that. So that quickly changed. But why I wanted to be a pediatrician is really my love for kids was always there, even when I was a kid myself, always wanting to take care of younger kids and supporting them to be the healthiest and amazing kids that can be. So I've just shifted a little bit in how I do that. I definitely I'm not a doctor, but I've shifted kind of in the context of how I serve to make sure that those kids and those same folks can be the best and healthiest kids that they can be.
Absolutely. And you're helping people along their journey right now too, in your current role in a different way, and providing incredible support, empowerment, and I'm sure mentorship as well. If you fast forward to today, you're now the Global Talent Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. How do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point, especially at IDEO?
I think everything about my personal journey, I am a firm believer that everything happens for a reason. And I feel like every moment has led up into being in this role that I'm in and doing the work that I do and doing the job that I have. So much of my personal journey, it was around recognizing my relationship to myself. And in that was a lot of, what was my understandings of race early on. I think like a lot of folks of color started to learn what that meant. My earliest memories of knowing and understanding race were in kindergarten. And then, starting to understand and starting to see the differences between I'm not Black and I'm not white. What does it mean to be brown? What does it mean to be Filipino and Asian? And had a lot of racial identity things going on in kind of those high school years. And what led me specifically to wanting to do this as my job, I think, was in college, I wanted to understand a little bit at a deeper level what all those questions that were coming up earlier on around identity and race and who I was. And I knew that there had to be something else. Like I wasn't the only one who could be experiencing this. And that's vulnerable too, to ask someone else. I was like, in an academic setting, what could I do? So I ended up majoring in American Studies with a focus on racial justice so that I could understand or have tools or frameworks to help me understand myself in this world, the individual to the interpersonal to the societal. And I think that's what led me to this work, because so much of it is not just understanding it, but feeling it and helping other folks understand how to kind of contextualize that, but how giving other folks the frameworks around like, this is real. You're not alone. It's hard to ask for help. It's hard to even tell other folks I'm struggling and I don't know what's happening. So I think a lot of those moments growing up and looking back, I had a lot of those moments, and even early on in my earliest memories, I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? I'm not sure what's happening. So I think a lot of that has led me to saying, okay, what are the tools that I can, start to learn, and then I can start to help others access so that we can all have a shared understanding of like, how do we do this together and not feel like we're in isolation?
absolutely. I definitely resonate when I was a kid in like first grade going to the library and seeing, okay, the characters in this book, I'm not Black or white, I'm Asian. What does that mean to me? And I think your point about having common language and understanding and frameworks is so important as well, especially when we're talking about this feeling of knowing, you're moving through the world and your identity
Right.
and bringing that into the workplace, which is a micro
Right.
the communities you're a part of. It's so important. And I think some people are further along in their journey than others, of course. But I would like to think, that people are making an effort to really understand themselves, do the internal work. I know when we were talking, one of the kind of aspects of this conversation, which is talked about a little bit less, is around power dynamics at work, and how, historically power dynamics have shown up with regard to race, equity in the workplace. A lot of startups and companies in general say they have this quote unquote open door policy, a flat structure, there's no titles, but we know that power dynamics show up at different work relationships, if you say it or not. Can you share your philosophy around like how to meaningfully acknowledge this and kind of intentionally have a conversation around power dynamics?
Yeah. First, to kind of make a note about organizations that say that there's no hierarchy or that there's a flat structure. And if there are organizations that have figured out and have designed a way where that can be true, that is amazing and that is great. I'm all ears of hearing more about that. But in most cases, a lot of organizations or a lot of people, really, a lot of folks in organizations will say those things, saying like, oh, like we don't really have a hierarchy or we're pretty flat, like you can talk to anyone. That's a flag in a lot of spaces around that organization is designed for the majority and folks in privilege, because it doesn't acknowledge that there are actually hierarchies at play. And when you don't acknowledge those, it actually invisibilizes some other folks and it actually creates even greater power to navigate for folks. And especially for those folks who don't fall into those certain buckets. Um, and that is structurally how the organization is. That doesn't even start to include other power dynamics that exist outside of the organizational structure, like you were naming around race and gender and those things. When you start to integrate those things, then you have, not just the structure of the organization, those power dynamics at play, but you also have kind of social power dynamics at play. So folks who are individual contributors and individual contributors who are also folks of color who are coming from the LGBTQAI plus communities and other marginalized identities, they have to navigate an organization that says this is not true and essentially is gaslighting them in the experiences that they're actually navigating. So when acknowledging power dynamics, to your question around how do you meaningfully acknowledge or intentionally have a conversation about power dynamics, I think you kind of named what I tell folks to do before they start to do that is you have to understand first your own positionality and also your own relationship to power before you can truly and start to intentionally have a conversation about power dynamics. And when I talk about positionality, it's not just your position in an organization, but positionality focuses on how our individual identities are constructed and how those identities shape the different interactions we have with different folks. And it's important to not, for example, for myself in the seat that I sit in now, I'm not only a director at IDEO, but I'm also a woman of color. So there are things in how I show up and how I navigate power dynamics includes all of those things. It doesn't dismiss any of those parts of who I am, both in structurally as a director, but also as a woman of color socially. So I think before you can meaningfully have a conversation about power dynamics, you have to have a really strong sense of self, or at least have to start to have that conversation around that and naming those power dynamics and taking ownership of the power that you might have in certain situations. I think with that, I named earlier too, is knowing what your own relationship to power is. I think oftentimes when folks have some type of, whether it's structural or social power, depending on what your relationship to it, that impacts how you can have a conversation around that. There are some folks who are like, I dismiss that. I don't have any type of power here. So I can't do anything about that. that doesn't create the conditions for other folks who don't have that power to have a meaningful conversation around that.
Mhm. I think that kind of internal self-awareness around positionality and identity is really important, and doing your homework in terms of, okay, I identify as this way. How does that historically play into
Right.
context of the, individual contributor manager relationship, the societal context around race, and all these different kind of systemic things that we are looking at here today as well, and understanding how you show up in this conversation, no matter how maybe fluffy the language is around like no hierarchy
Right.
and these things, just taking a realistic look at how you show up in the workplace. And I do want to kind of bring it a level down too, to talk about that relationship between your manager, because oftentimes, that's the person that you're communicating with more often than not than an executive or another leader of a company. And there's a lot of talk around how the role of the manager has significantly changed over time,
Mhm.
especially over the past 2 years. But what advice do you have for managers of individual contributors to really acknowledge their own bias and hold themselves accountable to lead with that equity mindset? So, for
Mhm.
example, if the new manager is managing teams with different identities, either visible or non-visible than themselves.
Yeah. I think building off of one, knowing yourself, because you without knowing yourself, you can't really start to support other folks. Because
Mhm.
when you support other folks, especially when there is a power dynamic, if you are a manager, what can happen is through those biases, you can start to project who you are, how your ways of doing and ways of being onto those you are managing. And without understanding or even having that level of awareness around this is what I like, you can't create this space for the person that you're managing to actually name that's great, and like here's how I want to enter into this, or here's how I want to show up, and here's how I want to do my work. That's not to dismiss. I think oftentimes, especially at this mid-level management, the people level, the people manager role, folks are saying, well, does that mean I dismiss all the years of experience that I have? And it's no, it's not. It's saying there is a space to bring in your expertise in the work that you do, but that doesn't mean how you do it, and how you are managing someone needs to be exactly the way that you do. It's an art, and when as people managers, we also have to recognize, like, we are engaging with people, with humans, and we all have different ways of being. We have all been socialized to operate in different ways. And there's no one objective good and right way of being. So I think when it comes to that manager and employee relationship, it's one, again, getting to know yourself. And then two, creating the conditions and the space for the person that you're managing to actually name around how they want to show up. And then it becomes a conversation around, okay, what conditions need to be true for you to be successful, for you to feel like you can show up as your best self. And then thinking about, okay, how do we create those conditions together? But without first knowing yourself and knowing that you may potentially project onto the folks that you're managing your way of being without that level of awareness, then you can't create and intentionally create those conditions that then create the conditions for trust and for safety for your manager. So, and we know that when there's trust and safety, like that's when folks are thriving and they're able to, to be successful in their jobs and their roles, because they're not having to navigate kind of all those other barriers around, like, am I safe? Can I name this? That doesn't feel right. So they're navigating those things on top of doing their jobs. And we find that those folks, that's where stereotypes, threat, and all those things come into play.
Absolutely. I appreciate what you're talking about in terms of how are we socialized to show up, whether that's in the workplace or just in society in general, and then creating conditions where people can do their best work. I was talking to someone the other day, and he was talking around non-negotiables and really setting that up for your team and for the company at large around mental health, around what support really looks like, and really having what you were talking about, a two-way conversation with folks about when they do their best work and how they show up, and just really empathetically listening to, because the odds of you as a people manager having the same kind of work schedule and the same kind of preferences in terms of just working as well is going to be really low, because people are complicated and they're
Right.
different. I want to kind of ask your opinion on, listening and of course active listening as well. Specifically at kind of IDEO, how do you see like a culture of listening and employee kind of feedback management as an important tool to building that at the company at large?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because as we all of us enter in a workplace, we all think that we know what listening is, and active listening at that, and versus, just hearing and then moving to action. I think that's a big thing that we're starting to lean into and even learn and continue to learn about an idea on like what does active listening look like,
Mhm.
right? And even at that people manager level, and how do you start to get to a place of action? I think that's what's hard too. And like, when do I listen? When do I coach? When do I give the advice? And that all starts with first understanding and providing a space for listening. I think a big part of listening too is that psychological safety, right? In order for us to listen, we have to have trust for folks to come to us to talk, to provide the space for us to even listen. So I think that's an important piece around how are we creating that trust with whoever you are trying to, whatever community that whether that's communities or that's an individual that you're managing. How
Mhm.
are you creating the conditions of trust and safety so that person can actually come to you, so that you can actually start to use that muscle of active listening? I think especially senior leaders and leadership in general, sometimes we don't hear, or we don't get those opportunities to listen because of the power dynamics, really,
Right.
right? Because folks don't feel like they can come to us because, well, we have the final decision, or we have more power, so what does it matter if I say anything as an individual contributor? um so I think active listening has a huge part in the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it has to start with, creating the conditions of trust, of psychological safety for folks, for individuals, for communities, as a leadership, for them to go to you and feel like they're being listened to, but also that someone is going to take action towards those things too. I think many, as a leader, and even in, at IDEO and our people manager training, there are different options around like, what do you do after someone comes to you and you're listening to them? Do they want you to take action? Do they want you to just be an ear in that moment? And what hat are you wearing in that moment, right? And I think as leaders, that's kind of our responsibility to understand, okay, what is our role here? I think for me too, it's as a leader, I often say like, I'm in service of our most marginalized, I'm in service of our community. It's not that those folks are in service of me. So active listening has to be a key part of my role, because if I'm projecting and assuming what our community needs, I'm not actually meeting the need of those communities. Therefore, I'm not actually creating a more equitable organization.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think if you're assuming what people need and what they want and not having conversations with them, then you're not really being intentional around the strategy either. And it's kind of, you're not bringing people into the conversation and able to meet folks where they are as well, which is also the goal too.
Right. And I think listening to and active listening, it's a muscle, because
Yeah.
oftentimes too, as leaders, we can also oftentimes use confirmation bias in how we're listening. We're going to listen for what we think we need, or confirming what our beliefs are. So I think kind of that openness too is such a key part of listening too, around like, we might hear something that doesn't necessarily align with what we want to hear.
Yeah. I think openness, having a growth mindset coming into the conversation and just maybe having a hypothesis of what it's about, but also just being open to whatever the person has to say and understanding your role. Are you their manager? Are you a mentor? What role do you see
Right.
in the organization? What you were talking
Mhm.
about too. Sometimes it is just, they want someone that they trust to listen to, but other times it is, no, like we want action to happen as well. I want to ask your opinion in terms of anonymous feedback and why it's important to also have another avenue for
Yes.
anonymous feedback at a company. Sometimes I hear from leaders that, one hand, there is this culture of, no, you can go to anyone on the people team or even maybe the equity and inclusion and belonging team and, say things that are confidential or give feedback. So we don't need an avenue for anonymous feedback. Other times, folks say that they're a little bit afraid of what's going to come up in anonymous feedback as well. But I wanted to know your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think having an anonymous feedback and is important because trust. I keep honing in on trust and trust, but it's so important in this work. And trust is built with organizations and their communities, and with leaders and individuals, and with leaders and in other communities, especially with the most marginalized communities.
Yeah,
that's built. That's not something that is inherently, as you join in a company, that like, oh, like trust is here.
absolutely.
So I think sometimes organizations, wherever they're starting, and sometimes it's not wherever they're starting, that's just the culture, there isn't that trust. And so when you say like, well, when you don't have something like an anonymous feedback tool or space, you're essentially missing feedback that could make that organization be like strive to be more equitable. So I'm not, I think for some organizations, it could start with anonymous tool, and then maybe over time, as the trust is built, you can, choose to go a different direction. But what I think the anonymous tool provides is it creates the conditions for folks to feel like they can start to trust the organization. Where I'm like, I'm able to express this without putting myself in a position where I feel like, my opinion or what I'm reporting can be weaponized. And part of that, in order to even get there, has to have an organization has to have an honest conversation around like, there are going to be some folks who don't trust, our DEIB team.
Right.
And that's a reality. It's not about the DEIB team not doing its job well. It's about the reality of like, this is our community. How do we create the conditions for trust to at least be foundational for us to get to a place of, okay, we can have honest conversations, and an anonymous tool allows for transparency to be shared, but also trust to be built, that you can start to create that foundation and you can build from there.
Absolutely. It's another way to create those conditions. And I think it is really important also to capture everybody's opinion as well. So just because you're getting 90% of folks like who are willing to speak up in an all hands, it doesn't mean the 10% of folks, you still want their opinion as well. And make sure that when you do give it, it's not weaponized or you're feeling retaliation, not because of the company, but everybody is bringing different experiences with them as well. I know I've been asking kind of specific questions around strategy and kind of building trust to your point as well. But I do want to bring up also, as we were talking about before this conversation, a Forbes article that recently talked about the roles of DEIB teams, specifically for folks who identify as BIPOC. And the article talked about how BIPOC folks do not want or need to be a company's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging person. And we both had strong feelings about this. Can you share your experience from this perspective?
Yes, I do. I do have strong feelings about this. I think there's multiple things. I think one, the idea of hypervisibilization versus invisibilization also comes up for me, especially for folks of color, or some of those marginalized identities that have physical attributes to it.
Yeah.
That there's an assumption when, oh, you come from a marginalized group, so like you want to do this right. It's tokenizing, but it also creates this like, either someone may be like, this is not the work that I've signed up to do, where it hyper visibilizes an identity that they don't want to have hyper visibilized,
right,
and feels like they have to step into that and enact on that, and it puts them in a position where like, I don't want it to seem like I'm not about this. But now you've created this narrative and these conditions where like, I feel like I have to step into it.
Yeah.
Or invisibilization, where there are folks who do want to do this work and they're not called onto it, and they don't feel like they are being seen. So I think a big part of that is like, how do you kind of navigate that? Part of that is asking someone. I think there's so much around like, oh, you want to do, there's a lot of assumptions that go with that.
Yeah.
And my first thing, even in any organization, the organization that I'm a part of, and when I'm talking to other folks who are navigating this work, is like, ask them if they want to do this work.
Yeah.
It's a very simple thing versus, leaders in a room saying, well, like so and so works on that, so they probably want to do that. And I was like, well, we should probably ask them, because one, is that a part of their job accountabilities? And if it's not, we're adding accountabilities. So we should ask them if they have the capacity and if they want to. And then two, we should compensate them, because this is an ask that comes outside of their accountabilities. And I think oftentimes when it comes to DEI work, it's like, oh, well, like they want to grow their capacity here. Like they just want to do this, without understanding, like, no, this is something that is outside of their job accountabilities. And especially for marginalized identities, often those are the folks who are being asked to do it. It comes with an emotional weight to the work. So those folks should be compensated for that.
I definitely agree. Compensation is really important, especially when we're talking about additional labor. It's often a part-time or an additional full-time job as well, whether you're leading an initiative, an employee resource group, you're on a diversity, equity, and inclusion council, you're part of a club. Like all of these things take time, emotional labor, as you were talking about as well. And simply asking the question instead of assuming could save a lot of time and
A
effort.
lot of time.
It's so important. It's so important. Don't assume. I think it's also interesting because you have to think about hyper visualization, and you don't want to make someone feel like they are invisible as well.
Right.
You want to raise their hand. So naming that is also
Right.
important.
I think just to really quickly
Yeah.
build on that, another part of that too is that when you assume anyone who's coming from a marginalized identity wants to do this work, it can do this work, it actually dismisses the work, rigor, and practice of folks who have been, practicing and doing very intentional DEI work. There's an assumption too that DEI work, if you're passionate about it, that means that you could just do it. And I think part of that is true, right? We all have our role in creating an equitable and just organizations and just society. And there are folks who have dedicated their careers to learning and being and practicing and doing this work well. So when you kind of assume that any person with a marginalized identity, one that may not even want to do it, but
Right.
also may not have the capabilities to be able to do that. Because what happens is people then also start to assume that life experience means that they want to do this work for a living.
Mm-hmm.
And that has a lot of assumptions and a lot of things around how folks can start to navigate this work. So I think, and how we intentionally do this work with best practice behind it.
Mm-hmm. I think intentionality is really important. You brought up as well accountability, which I think is also something that people need to think about internally, and also holding others accountable as well. I think modeling from leadership is also really important, holding leaders to a high standard there as well. We touched on this a little bit in terms of really making sure the organization is set up for, great working conditions, and to ensure that folks feel like they can do the best that they can. And in terms of operationalizing equity, there are some conversations around relating that to performance reviews and bonus compensation, asking questions around, can you point to examples for leaders and people managers of how you made your processes more equitable? And again, tying that to compensation. So
Yeah.
to kind of ask, can you tell us about how like you're thinking about like redesigning workplaces and what
Yeah.
that really looks like in practice?
Yeah. I mean, I think you named a lot of those things. I think historically and before, it would be seen as like DEI is a separate thing. Like you all have your own work stream over here. And I think a lot of it actually is about making sure and integrating equity into the processes and people processes and organizational processes that already exist. And for startups, it's really thinking about like how you design that now, versus an afterthought. And how we're doing that, how I'm doing that, is looking at our internal systems and doing some like an audit of sorts, and like thinking about like internal systems innovation, where in our systems has it been designed to serve the majority of our folks. And oftentimes most of our processes are like that, right? Because folks in the majority are designing those systems. And that's, again, it's not intentionally designing it in a way that it could be inequitable, but that's what the outcome becomes. So it is looking at things around performance management.
Mhm.
Where are the opportunities for bias that come into play? How do we integrate more moments where bias checks can happen?
Right.
How do we, not only in the process, but also how do we upskill our people managers to understand that? So there's like the piece around upskilling our managers, but also the process in itself around like, how do we have some more bias checks? And that's connected, of course, to how we pay people. How do
Mhm.
we, and what is equitable pay? And how do we make sure that our system and our process actually is equitable to get to equitable pay as an outcome, rather than doing like equitable pay analyses every year, right? And it's ideal, we would have a system and we would design the process and the system that will get to an outcome of equitable pay.
Mhm.
And now, like, there's so many tools now that like help organizations able to do that. And then from there, it's also, it's looking really at the full employee life cycle. So upon, recruiting, our recruiting team at IDEO has done a great job of identifying where biases show up in the interview process, making sure that we have like clear criteria, clear attributes, and all of those things, so that those opportunities for bias are mitigated or at least lessened. And then, going into what we talked about, performance management and pay, into, retention, which has a lot of things. How do we start to understand the accountabilities for our people managers? How do we make sure that we are upskilling them so that they are able to be successful in that? It's not enough to say you are now accountable for that, but we have to be able to provide the resources so that folks can be successful in those things. I think there's the processes themselves too, and also things around like transparency,
Mhm.
and communication. I think is a big thing that we're thinking about and we're trying to be better at IDEO too. Is, they say knowledge is power, right? And
Right.
that's true. So power sharing then in that case would mean transparently sharing what information you have. And there are moments, right, where you have to be intentional about like, this information is not helpful for this, this community, or can be harmful or whatnot around who gets
Sure.
that. But how do you lead with transparency rather than leading with, it has to be this very put together, like nicely tied, neat bow on top before we share it with other folks? And that's a decision in the process, not necessarily in design. And that's for everything from processes to programs to trainings. It's like, how do you bring people in sooner? Going back to trust, because that allows for that trust to be built, you know. And for example, like a lot of the commitments that were made after George Floyd, a lot of organizations, saying like, we have to do this, and it has to look good, and we have to put it out. But it's like, how do we say like, we haven't made the commitment, we haven't made as much progress here, and we're transparently sharing that internally, at least with our community, saying we haven't done this and here's why, but here's what we're striving towards. It's a very different narrative, and a lot creates the conditions for trust in a different way than says, let's not say anything until we've hit that marker. So I think transparency and, thinking about that, and, even looking at, there's a lot of tools around like, even like looking at Tim Kuhn's like white supremacy culture, things like that. Like, how do you look at that and say like, how do we create conditions where we're not striving towards that?
Mhm.
So there's a lot of different resources around, and reimagining workplace. I
Yeah.
think that's so much about, at least how I see, the work that I do in equity, is that, reimagining systems that folks don't necessarily have the capacity or don't want to reimagine, that actually is in service of everyone, in service of our most marginalized, that then becomes in service of everyone. Um, but to reimagine systems and processes is also very intimidating.
Oh, absolutely. I think what you were talking about also in terms of transparency and effective communication, if that isn't happening, lends itself to assuming on the team side as well that if I came to Jen or if I shared this piece of feedback with the company and then I hear nothing about it for, a year or two time, it goes into a black box. I think you're not actively listening to me as well. And it depreciates that trust that we're talking about as well. So I think that is super critical to understand. And this is a huge opportunity to redesign systems, even though it is very work intensive. It's a long process. It's not going to change overnight, but I think it's
Right.
important to hold ourselves accountable to think about how we can fix something, even if it's not quote unquote broken or we don't view the
Right.
broken yet, because it probably honestly is.
Yeah.
There's a common phrase around kind of work that, the ideal is you want to bring your full self to work. I have an idea of maybe what you think around this, but do you think it's a realistic goal for everyone to feel they can bring their full selves to work?
Realistic, I don't know. I think that's probably not even the question, right? Because we should be striving for folks to have choice first and how much they want to bring themselves to work. Um, and if it's realistic or not, that shouldn't stop organizations from continuing to work to create the conditions for all folks to choose what parts of themselves they want to bring to an organization. I think, my I don't necessarily think that like all folks will want to bring themselves their full selves to work. I remember, hearing that early in my career and being like, I don't want to bring my full self. Like, I don't want you to see who I am in this part of my life at work.
Yeah.
Um, and organizations should still try to create the conditions for folks to bring whatever parts of themselves they want to bring without feeling like those parts are going to be weaponized against them, consciously or unconsciously. So I think uh realistic, probably not. I don't know. Does it mean that we should stop striving for that? No. Um, and it should mean, that we are intentional though, and that we are recognizing in order for folks to bring them full selves to work, for them to bring whatever parts that they want to bring to the workplace, we all have to do our own work to understand what parts of ourselves, of how the conditions and the environments that we are creating are not creating those conditions. And part of that goes back to, I feel like I'm a broken record. It's 45 minutes is knowing yourself.
Know
You
yourself.
can't create those conditions for someone else without knowing first how you've been socialized, how you create those conditions, and how you potentially can cause harm. We can have the greatest intentions. A lot of workplaces, folks are like, I'm not trying to create, the space where folks don't feel like they can belong, but that doesn't change the impact.
Right.
And in order for us, we have to do the work around what you were talking about, the processes, in addition to kind of that individual internal work, and understand how the individual is related to the interpersonal, is related to the institutional, for us to get to that full sense of, okay, now, we're doing our best to create the conditions for everyone to bring whatever parts of they want to bring to work.
Absolutely. I mean, I definitely agree with you. And I think it is really important, even if you've said it kind of multiple times throughout. And I think it's sometimes scary for people to look internally at themselves as well, which is why sometimes people don't do it. And there's this question of just like who, thinking about your identity, again, your positionality, and coming to terms with that too, how you show up. It is really important. So I don't think it can be said and or encouraged. But up until this point, I've asked a lot of, specific questions, things that we've discussed, but open-ended on purpose. But what's taking up the most brain space in your mind right now?
I think, lately I've been really thinking about what it means in this work to center the most marginalized. And that's what's taking up the most space, because in this work, in DEI work, so much of it has to be around like bringing everyone along and bringing up, like, folks in privilege along, folks in the majority along, so that they understand why this work is important, so that they understand the harm that they can potentially cause. And sometimes in that means that the folks we are trying to serve don't get the full support and resources that they need. So I think what's been taking up my mind, is how do we continue to also create resources and programs for our most marginalized? Because we have created programs for people managers, we have created programs for folks to learn and understand DEI. What about the folks who have been living this, who have the resiliency, but also like they deserve the support, the resources to thrive? So how do we make sure that we are balancing, and if not even more so giving the resources to our most marginalized to thrive. So that's been taking up my brain space around like, what is that? How do we continue to do that? What resources, what programs, do we make sure that our most marginalized have, in addition to making sure that the folks in the majority and our allies, we're bringing those folks along, because we very much need all of those folks for us to get to our goal of being a more equitable organization.
Absolutely. I think that's an important question to ask as well, and something that folks can ask themselves individually is, who am I excluding in this conversation? Who could potentially be, excluding in the process as well? Not again based on like your intention to do that, but again what the impact is as well. Jen, is there anything that I either didn't ask you in our conversation, or a key takeaway about building trust and being intentional, or anything that we've talked about that you want to underscore for our listeners?
I mean, I think I've underscored trust and knowing self a lot in the past 45 minutes. So I will double underscore that, because I think oftentimes it can be intimidating and feel like a lot when folks are trying to locate themselves in diversity, equity, inclusion efforts.
Yeah.
There's some folks who are like, I know what I want to do. This is what I'm going to do. And there's some folks who are like, I've never had to talk about myself in a workplace in this type of context. So I think just, giving yourself the space to first know yourself will really help in starting to understand how you push this for an organization. And I would say for folks who are like, where do I start? How do I even start that? I mean, I would start with Bobby Harrow's work around the cycle of socialization. There's so much out there. There's a lot of activities, like you can Google it, around, the identity wheel and who you are, and just start there. Start understanding who you are, start understanding how you've been socialized. That will really start in helping you understand and locate yourself around like, okay, what does this look like, and how do I start to take action personally in the roles that I have in the organization that I'm in.
There's a ton of resources out there, so just start is a good place to.
Yes, for sure.
For sure. Jen, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. As always, I really enjoyed speaking with you this afternoon.
It's been a joy and a pleasure and an honor. Thank you for inviting me, Christina.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the company to succeed on a whole. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.